Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic.
Hi, I'm Freddie deBoer. I am a doctoral candidate at Purdue University where I study literacy education.
And we're going to talk today about teachers and teacher tenure and education reform and this whole big cluster of issues that I've written about a bit and you've written a fair amount about. Um, we, we kind of, I think we've disagreed about this in the past, but most recently you wrote a blog post kind of expressing frustration at people who think that teachers are a big part of the problem in education today. I don't know. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, and I mean that particular. I mean, obviously that's a very large question. That particular
Yeah.
blog post is my frustration with what I see as um, an attitude from a lot of pundits and journalists that sort of constantly ask for more accountability from teachers, which is not matched, in my view, by similar structures inside the world of journalism and punditry, which frustrates me. And so the particular issue that we disagreed on is there was an interview with David Brooks where he said, I mean, and I can't call it anything other than bragging. He's called himself impossible to fire. He said that he'd be doing this for years and that he can write about whatever he wants. That there's no sort of nobody sort of checking his work. And for a guy who was repeatedly argued that teachers need to be more accountable, and specifically that it needs to be easier to fire teachers, I find that kind of gross. And aside from that sort of the grossness of sort of gloating about your own job security in a world where a lot of people don't have it, I also think it sort of speaks to this sort of policy question of teacher tenure.
So this was a David Brooks interview where he was talking about what it was like to be an op-ed columnist at the New York Times,
Mm-hmm.
and I think in the full context of the interview, he talked about various tough parts about the job. He said that finding something to write about twice a week, every week, is very difficult. Things like that. He also expressed that it is in many ways an enviable job, and that he can travel anywhere that he wants to, and that no one ever tells him what to write about, and that he made the point that basically this is I don't know if he used the words a tenured position, but that was basically what he was saying, that once you're op-ed columnist at the Times, it's very rare for you to be fired.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So I guess one disagreement I had with this is that David Brooks does in fact have a job that not very many people get fired from. You know, you can think of the people who are at the Times doing that job right now, and most of them have been there for a very long time. Most of the people who have left that job have either died or retired.
Mm-hmm.
I think Bill Kristol is an example of someone who kind of had that job and didn't really work out. But I think for the most part it is a very secure job. Um, I think my take on that is that New York Times op-ed columnist is a secure job because once you've reached that point, and especially after you've done it for a little while, you attain a degree of fame that means that you have a big readership. And the Times op-ed columnists are there in large part because Times readers like reading them. Times readers like reading David Brooks if his traffic and his the number of times that he appears on the most emailed list and the public appearances that he does on behalf of the Times and the little chat he does with Gail Collins, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if we can separate for a moment how good he is at his job of actually being a columnist, as far as like the quality of his work, right? And maybe you and I disagree about the quality of his work. I don't know, but just from a business perspective, David Brooks is a very good employee for the bottom line of the New York Times, I would argue, and I would think that his job security and his celebrity are kind of tied up in the same way that being like the anchor on the nightly news, right? Once people become comfortable with you, they like reading you, they like seeing you again and again on the nightly news. It's just that kind of gig. But in fact, David Brooks doesn't actually have tenure, right? Like, and one of my frustrations with your analogy was basically, my frustration with teachers who can't be fired is oftentimes like a teacher will commit some kind of like physical assault on a student, And in LAUSD, the school district where I live, it takes like 10 years to fire someone in this circumstance. And that seems absurd to me. And I think that if David Brooks were to walk into the New York Times and assault his editor or assault a fellow employee, or like, if he were sitting in the Times building and a Times reader came in and he assaulted that reader, it isn't at all clear to me that David Brooks would keep his job after that. Certainly, he wouldn't have any protection that entitled him to a bunch of due process that stretched on for years. And so it seems to me that the analogy just doesn't work. That, David Brooks may or may not have too much job security in a way that's ideal for journalism, right? But he doesn't have what we would call tenure. And he doesn't have it in a job where one could argue, if what you want from an opinion columnist is intellectual honesty and arguing things despite incentives to the contrary, right? I suppose you could make a case that columnists should have some sort of tenure. I don't think in the real world that they should. But it is in fact the case that journalists do not have that kind of tenure and teachers do. So I don't really see, that was one of my problems with your post.
Well, but I mean, you just said the word incentives, right? And part of my frustration is precisely that David Brooks didn't just say, like, teachers have tenure, right? And we'll link to a piece where he makes the case that I'm saying explicitly. He says that the existence of tenure, right? And he said stuff about this, not just about teachers, but also about professors in the past, and we'll dig it up, that the existence of tenure, right, necessarily degrades the quality of work because it removes the incentive to do well, right? I mean, he's saying that the logic, like the fundamental economic logic of tenure is broken. And then he's saying that he has de facto tenure. And it may be true that he doesn't have a legal sort of actionable defense of his job security in the way that some teachers do and some professors do. But it's the case that he certainly feels that he has tenure. I mean, he said so himself. He feels that he is unfireable. And I think that it's very important to ask ourselves, how susceptible is David Brooks's job security to metrics? Because one of the questions that we're dealing with right now, and this is, we'll separate these out because I think it's important to, is not just whether teachers should be held accountable, but whether they should be held accountable to certain quantitative metrics over which they have debatable amounts of control. I don't think if David Brooks suddenly fell off of the face of the most emailed list, or if he stopped getting clicks, that he would suddenly be fired. And it's certainly my impression from what he's had to say that he doesn't feel that way either. But, okay, so you want to talk about, like, truly bad apples, teachers who do things like break the law. Okay. Well, as you yourself have pointed out, there's many teachers and people within teachers' unions who would like to make it easier for us to fire them as well, right? So we need to be careful to separate two separate issues, which is whether teachers' unions are an impediment to the improvement of standardized test scores, which many people in that reform camp say they do. But that's a separate issue. Fine. The second is this issue of removing, like, truly bad apples, people who are criminal or negligent or truly incompetent. Okay. Well, so we have to ask ourselves, why would the unions continue to insist on this level of due process, even for people for whom it seems like the case for termination is so obvious? Well, the reason is because unions have to have a policy of going to the mat every single time. And the reason why they have to is because we are living in a climate of such consistent political and policy assault on unions, where there's been so much enormous effort to degrade their ability to collectively bargain and to organize. When they've had
hold on. That isn't why unions have to go to the mat for every member. I mean, unions,
sure it is.
In fact, represent every member, good teachers and bad teachers. They have to go to the mat for them because their function. I mean, the worst teachers in schools right now that are members of the union pay dues to the union, right?
Yeah.
The teachers union exists to represent all teachers in bargaining. So
that's how it works. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think
they have to
agree.
The function of a union is to be an advocate for all of its members, right? And those structures have to exist because of the fundamental power imbalance between workers and employers. And they have to be extreme in the prosecution of protecting their workers because the environment that we have now after 60 years of assaults on union rights is so toxic and it's so inherently set against unions, that they have to sort of hold on tight to every protection that they have. I think that you could imagine a world where unions are more likely to be partners in removing bad teachers, like these truly bad apples. But I can't imagine it under the current political and policy environment where the slightest attack on teachers is seen as a wedge through which the unions will be destroyed. And just look at this tenure case in California, right? This major case in which tenure was found to be, in a federal court, tenure was found to violate equal rights because it was the bad teachers supposedly are overwhelmingly found with poor and minority students. Immediately after that case happened, many in the ed reform crowd began to say that this was the wedge with which teachers' unions, not with tenure generally, and teachers' unions' protections and collective bargaining could begin to be beaten down. And that's the environment in which these unions operate, in which if you give the slightest inch, they'll take a mile and destroy the whole edifice. It does not surprise me.
Right. I mean, you could make this same argument about all kinds of entities, right? And it doesn't seem particularly relevant to the larger question of what policy ought to be, right? Like the NRA could argue that they stand staunchly opposed to even what seems to everyone like reasonable gun control measures, because once you give the politicians an inch, they'll take a mile, and we'll end up in a place where gun rights are even more under assault than they are now, right? The truth or falsity of that statement has nothing to do with what policy ought to be.
Context matters, Connor.
I would argue, look, I mean, I'm not saying that context doesn't matter, and I would actually quibble a bit on the context, because I think that public employee unions and private sector unions are in much different places and face much different constraints than one another right now, right? You can point to, efforts in the private sector in some companies to, campaign against unions when an election comes up in a responsible way, and you can point to other efforts that are just, corporations doing terrible things and using coercive power in terrible ways. And I don't think that you can point to the same thing in the public sector. And I don't think that the relationship between labor and management in the public sector is at all the same as it is in the private sector, because you don't have, when a teachers union goes and sits down with a school board to negotiate a contract, right? The people who are on the school board are not, it's not coming out of their profits when they negotiate the salaries with the teachers. And in many cases, in California, the state I'm most familiar with, the politicians who are ultimately setting policy are funded extremely heavily by the teachers. And it's a dynamic in this state where it's the same thing in private prisons, in police departments, and in schools. What I see is unions that are tremendously powerful because they spend a lot of money on lobbying and on campaign contributions. And they have orchestrated a system by which their worst members, the worst employees in the union, right, are not accountable. And this has terrible effects in prisons with the abuse of prisoners and with bad apple guards who are not fired and who, continue to abuse prisoners and be violent and smuggle drugs in and all kinds of things. And it happens in the public schools as well, where the worst teachers are either taken out of the schools and kept on the payroll, or else they are, or else they're kept in the classroom. And we can talk about the context, right, of how tough it is for organized labor generally in American society. We can talk about the unions and what their function is and what they're legally obligated to do and what they're morally obligated to do, right? But the question before us isn't, are unions bad people, or are unions sympathetic, or are unions, following their fiduciary duty or not? The question is, what should policy be? How much protection should teachers have from being fired? What should the process be? And my argument is that the process right now gives too much protection to bad teachers and makes it too hard to fire them.
But Connor, who is negotiating against these unions, right? Like, if you're asking what's the optimal policy solution, right? Like, you have to ask that equally of both sides. If the optimal policy solution, right, is to have less job protection for teachers than we have right now, then surely you can also argue perhaps that the optimal policy solution is not to reduce the amount of teacher protection as much as the ed reform movement does, which is essentially none, right? And this is like, I mean, it just seems to me like you approach this issue as if there is not an existing political apparatus that is already agitating to remove any job security for teachers at all, right? Like the education reform movement, despite enormous failure for 20 years, is one of the most powerful and well-funded political forces in this country. And it's powerful and well-funded in large measure because it is made up of for-profit entities that want to extract some of this value from public schooling and put it into their own pockets. So, like, it just seems to me like if you want to talk about this, like, deracinated policy argument without actually acknowledging, like, who's involved and what the stakes are. I mean, you're positing, this world where teachers have this enormous power to unionize, and yet somehow in your home state of California, the median teacher annual income is $41,000, which is well below the median household income of California, right? I mean, if they're so powerful, how come they can't get money that is, I mean, like, it's probably like half of what the median first-year lawyer is in California, right? So I don't understand,
Right.
like, if this is such a powerful entity, then why are they paid so poorly? I mean, I don't understand. I don't recognize the world that you're describing when you say that teachers have this ability to hold the state hostage.
Well, I mean, part of it is that, well, okay, so there are a bunch of different things going on here, right? One reason they're paid less than the median income of union labor is that they work significantly less than the average union employee, right? I mean, we're talking about jobs that are on 9 months and off 3 months. So it's hard to do an apples to apples comparison with people who are working with 2 weeks of vacation, maybe a year. You also have, I'm sorry. Sorry about that.
It's all right.
So one thing you have going on is a difficulty of comparing salaries across different union jobs, right? And again, if you compare teachers to like longshoremen, right? Some people argue that longshoremen are wildly overpaid. They're certainly benefiting from an ability to put a chokehold on ports and strike and kind of like monopoly rents, right? There are other union employees who have nothing like that kind of protection, right? But to me, teachers, or teachers' unions more accurately, have negotiated in such a way that what they have gotten, right, for their union power is job protection, and particularly job protection for a certain kind of teacher, right? Not new teachers and not the best teachers. They've gotten job protection for like teachers who have served a long time. And not just job protection, but like salary increases. The system is just set up in a way that longevity gets you a bigger paycheck, it gets you a bigger pension, and it gets you more job protection with every year that you serve. And it's just like throwing your hands up and saying, well, we can't measure which teachers are good or which teachers are better, so we'll just do it by straight up longevity. If layoffs have to be made, it's whatever teacher has the least amount of time under their belt. And when pay raises go out, it's just like whoever has served the most time here. And these are the contracts that teachers unions have negotiated, right? And obviously teachers unions can't just like print money, right? There is like an amount of money that legislatures spend on schools, and like I think that amount of money should be more. Other people think that it is, at the right amount right now, and it's just not being spent wisely. But my ideal policy is to have teachers be a lot more like lawyers or like people working in corporate America, where expectations are higher, you can be fired more easily, but you make a significantly more amount of money for that risk. And, you have more churn among the worst employees, and you can rise if you're among the best employees.
So let's ask ourselves why we... Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things that I think is a sound critique that you've been making in some of your posts on this subject, you basically say, teachers already are a low prestige profession, and this dissuades people from becoming teachers. And if you cut pay, this is just going to hurt the problem, and the quality of teachers is going to go down, right? If you get rid of tenure, if you get rid of the job protection, similarly, this is like a benefit that's lost, and the quality of teachers is going to go down, and perhaps the quality of public education is going to go down as a result. I agree with this, and how we get to better pay and less protection, my ideal world, to me, that should be like the explicit trade-off. Like the bill should be, you get less protection and you get more pay, and it should be in the same piece of legislation. And that's the direction to go. And I think that would increase the prestige of teachers, and obviously it would increase their pay. I think this would be worth it in decreased job protection because partly because I see no evidence, right, of teachers being fired for no reason in any kind of significant numbers, right? Like, in every sector in the economy, of course, there are people here and there that get fired unfairly. But I see no evidence that this is the case with teachers generally.
Because of the union, right, Connor? I mean, so listen, like, if the teachers themselves want to use this potentially incredibly powerful, and to me very natural tool of collective bargaining and make the choice, we would rather be a higher paying position with less job security. I think that would be a very rational choice for the teachers to make. I mean, that's up to them.
No, it wouldn't be a rational choice for the teachers who are already in the system and who have accumulated the most power Connor, by virtue of being there the longest.
But Connor, the teachers didn't simply dictate the current deal, right? They negotiated it with these municipal governments, right? And why?
Yeah, of course.
Like historically, why is it that teacher jobs, are high job security, low pay? They are because that's how the system needs to exist in order to function without massive increases in local property taxes. I mean, that was a bet that was made not just by the teachers. This was a decision that wasn't just made by teachers. It was also made by schools and school districts. And
I don't actually agree with this, right? Like I think that there are two important things that we're talking about here, right? Like one is what you just said. How did we get to the point where teachers have high job protection, and how did we get to the point where they have low pay, right? I would argue that these are both artifacts of two different things, right? At least in California, the high job protection was a progressive era reform because school districts were being used as places for like cronies to hand out jobs back in like the era of like Tammany Hall and machine politics, and like this was a good government reform. That was initially meant to stop elected officials from just willy-nilly replacing teachers every time that there was an election. And this is a time when teaching was just seen as like something that low-status women did, right? And this is the reason why teaching was a low-paid profession for a long time, because the entire edifice of public education in America was built off of a fact of like women having very few career opportunities, and a lot of women who are now, working at high-achieving jobs in law or in corporations or in other sectors in the nonprofit sector and government, what have you, were all working in public education then, right? And so I would argue that the current system that we have is a vestige of these old things that don't make sense anymore, right? I'm not saying that teachers shouldn't have any kind of protection from willy-nilly being fired by new political appointees. My ideal world isn't one where teachers have no protection at all, right? And my ideal world isn't one where any employee has no protection at all, right? In egregious cases, I'm perfectly okay with wrongful termination lawsuits, and I'm also perfectly okay with all of the classes of people that we protected from being fired for no reason, because they're a protected class. But um, I don't think that the reasons that this current system came into place the way it is still make sense.
Well, I mean, look, first of all, I think it's important to point out that, like, it's not for no reason that teachers are afraid of getting fired without due cause. This is what Michelle Rhee and her sort of class of education reformers are all about. I mean, that's someone with a lust for firing teachers, right? So it's not like they're just inventing this fear, okay? But okay, so
right,
again,
but how many teachers did Michelle Rhee actually fire? Right, and how many?
Because of the union, Connor. Because of the union, precisely because of the power that you're trying to degrade right now, they were able to prevent that sort of thing. Okay, and of course, we learned after the fact that in her tenure, Michelle Rhee had a massive problem with cheating that we only found out after the fact. Right, and this is a thing that has to kind of penetrate into your analysis at some point, Connor. Let's look at this just like sort of the Econ 101 kind of approach of incentives that is so popular on the internet. There's lots of people who go and get the same level of training and get the same kind of, you'll go and get a master's degree, and they have the opportunity to work in the public system, but they instead decide to work in the private system, in the Catholic school systems, in the parochial systems, whatever. They go and they get, their jobs are, from the outside, would appear to be far worse because they're almost always getting less money and they're always getting less job protection, right? So why would people do that? Why would people make that choice? They make that choice because the perception is that that kind of work is just massively easier than being a public school teacher because the student populations are not the same, right? And there's the whole rhetoric of the education reform movement says that we can't acknowledge the fact that different populations of students are not the same in terms of how hard they are to teach. It's still a no excuses movement. And if you look at somebody like Arne Duncan, right? Arne Duncan does not want to hear about the fact that the kids in the Newark high school system are not the same as the kids in the Greenwich, Connecticut high school system. So if you're a teacher and you see that there's more and more of this push towards this reductive standardized testing model of what it means to be a successful teacher, and you see that people want to tie your job security to that, and you see people like Arne Duncan and Obama and all these other reformers who say, I don't want to hear excuses about poverty, I don't want to hear excuses about fatherlessness, I don't want to hear excuses about crime, you can connect the dots, right? And if we're going to make this trade, and again, like I don't know where the money is going to come from, but that's a separate issue. It has to be tied to an acknowledgement that an honest accounting of education says that teaching different groups of students is just a matter of teaching. The job is far, far harder depending upon the demographics of the students. Reuters came out earlier this year with some really great reporting that demonstrated the massive efforts that charter schools go to in order to deliberately exclude the poorest students, the students with the biggest behavioral problems. And you say, well, why would they do that? Why would they go to that much trouble? Because they know that their outcomes are dependent on the student population that they're teaching. And we cannot talk about a grand bargain until we stop having the people at the top of the policy apparatus pretending like differences in student population don't matter.
So I absolutely agree with you that differences in student populations matter, and I don't want to have a system where there's like a standardized test and then certain kids do worse on it and then their teachers are fired. I think that would be absurd. And, when I look at a school system like LSD, and I look at a superintendent who is perfectly willing, right, to have some kind of teacher protection, is opposed to using test scores in the way you're talking about it, and still says, my hands are tied. I have these teachers who I acknowledge are underperforming woefully, some of whom have committed criminal acts, and I can't fire them, right? And you're telling me that we have to wait to fix this problem until the educational reformers, who you think are wrongheaded in many ways, and perhaps are, we have to wait until they acknowledge this thing that you want them to acknowledge? Like, we just have to leave these teachers in there until all of the political actors you're talking about acknowledge this truth, and we can't solve the problem until then?
Look, Connor, if it's simply a matter, I mean, like, if you were asking me, do I wish it was easier to fire teachers who are guilty of, rank incompetence or criminality or just things that should obviously lead to termination, even in the minds of unionized teachers, then of course I feel that way. I do think that you are taking this out of the sort of context of the broader policy and political world and the just massive disparities in the power of things like the education reform movement and the teachers unions. I mean, just hold on. I mean, like, I can't look at like the Common Core. Okay, I mean, I've written about this. It is absolutely frightening the speed with which Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation was able to implement one of the largest changes, and it's only started now to see resistance. But in something like 48 states, he was able to get, at least in principle, an acceptance of the Common Core standards, which is one of the largest changes in the history of American public education, despite the fact that he's never been elected by anybody. Nobody went through a sort of referendum process, right? So I think it's natural for teachers to fear the power of the education reform movement. Now, if you want to make this bargain, again, I think that that's up to the teachers to decide in their unions if they want to bargain that way. And again, it would make sense to me, right? But I think that you don't recognize, like, I'm glad that you think it's stupid to simply tie firing decisions to test scores, but I'm not making it up that there are plenty of people in the ed reform world who think that if you fail to meet arbitrary standards several years in a row, you should be terminated. Or merit pay, which can be extremely punitive in some of the proposed schemes, where your ability to pay for your life is dependent upon test scores that you don't directly control.
Sure. Look, if if the way that this would unfold is that a legislature would vote on a bill to, like, we're going to rejigger the way that teachers are fired, and we're going to do it in a way that like, we're going to pass the bill and then later we'll announce how it's going to be done, then the current political impasse would make sense to me, right? Mm-hmm. I would not ask teachers unions to support that bill, right? What I would wish that they would support, although I recognize that there are incentives against them doing so, is a bill that would make it easier to fire the worst teachers while maintaining various job protections that are reasonable, right? Randy Weingarten is a proponent of certain bills like this in various states that, in my view, don't go far enough, but are certainly an improvement on the status quo, right? She is, I forget all of the states that she is like the head of the teachers union for. She's not the head of the California Teachers Association, which mm-hmm. is hugely powerful and which is, enormously influential in California education policy. They are not going for any deal like this. They want the status quo. They want the status quo because it's impossible to fire their members. Why wouldn't you want that as a union, right? And my point here isn't to say they're bad people. My point is the incentives of the union diverge from the public good and from the good of the kids who are going to these schools. And, saying, oh, there are bad actors out there or powerful, nefarious actors out there in the education reform movement, to me seems like a non sequitur.
Yeah,
like,
but Connor,
let's say, for the sake of argument, that there are. I'm not saying that you should pass whatever they want. I'm saying that you should pass a reasonable law. And, when Randy Weingarten is out campaigning for this in other states, and she comes and says, well, I think California should pass it, but the law, but the atmosphere is poisoned in California, right? Invoking the same sorts of arguments that you are. There's no doubt in my mind that if the California Teachers Association wanted to pass a bill that increased accountability for the worst teachers, they could pass it through the legislature easily. That, there's no way that people on the other side of the aisle wouldn't go for like incremental improvement because they can't get anything else. They'll never get, the education reformers will never get anything through the California legislature. So I don't see I just don't see the dynamic you're talking about and how it would play out in the way that would strip teachers of all protection.
Connor, Mark Zuckerberg was able to buy whole-scale changes to the Newark school system. I understand that you're a California journalist. I understand that that's a place where you have special interest. But nationwide, what I'm talking about is not at all crazy. Mark Zuckerberg knows nothing about education. He's not an elected official, and yet he was able to inject so much money into the Newark school system that he was able to essentially undertake a policy takeover. And it was only from a rigorous protest of parents and teachers and students in that community that prevented him from getting whatever he wanted, right? Like, I understand that California has dysfunctional politics in many ways.
So your anecdote ends in him not getting to do what he wanted?
The anecdote ends with him not getting to do what he wanted because of a massive protest that involved dirt poor people against policy elites. And most of the time in this country, it doesn't go down like that. Look, like I just said to you, only now, because the Republicans have decided that it's a wedge with which to fight Obama, have we seen anything like organized resistance to Common Core. Common Core already happened. Okay? We're having retroactive after the fact resistance to it after Bill Gates was able to, when nobody was looking, throw so much money around that he got what he wanted in something like 48 states and the district, right? And like, I just think that, like, if your claim is that unaccountable elites, well-moneyed elites and forces of privatization, like, aren't able to enact enormous changes in public education, I just think that's nuts, Connor. I think that just is like contrary to reality.
Look, to me, the educational... Okay, look. First of all, yes, they can force discretionary changes very quickly by pouring a bunch of money in and saying it has these strings attached, right? And I think that there are times that works out for great ill. That is not my argument at all. I don't think that they can step in and have a bunch of money with strings attached and get rid of teachers' protections because they're embedded in contracts that have been signed that can't just be abrogated, right? So, and obviously here we're getting into the area where every jurisdiction is different, and there are a lot of them in America. To me, though, we can answer the question generally, whether it's in California, whether it's in any state in the union, how much protection should teachers have, right? How much job protection should they have? How much discretion should principals have to get rid of a teacher that they don't think is performing well? I don't think, I don't know if we hashed that out for a long time. I don't know if we would come to the same place, but I'm quite sure that we would come to a place that demanded a lot more accountability than a lot of huge jurisdictions have.
Okay, and I agree. All right, so here's what I think that you should do. Okay, I think that you should be part of a new education reform movement, a reform movement. I think that you should be someone who should be part of articulating a third path. Okay, now you and I are always going to disagree on teachers' unions, and you and I are always going to disagree about public sector unions in general. Okay, but part of the reason, and again, I'm sure you're sick of me saying this, but part of the reason why unions are so defensive and why people like me are so defensive is because we see all the deep problems with the currently existing education reform movement. Which, I mean, your magazine just ran a great piece about how companies like Pearson develop standardized tests and then they sell the books that have the answers to those texts. Like, those things make an enormous amount of difference in terms of the actual curriculum that happens, right? So we have this privatization, which, you mentioned that the incentives of educating public school children and keeping the union alive are in tension. Well, guess what? The incentives for Cengage or whatever other major privatized ed company and the incentive and the sort of the good of educating students also aren't perfectly aligned, right? We have people like Michelle Rhee, we have people like Arnie Duncan who, to me, simply refuse to acknowledge empirical reality that we keep finding, okay? In my opinion, the education reform movement of the last 20 years is one of the greatest policy failures in the history of American democracy, right? So if you feel like it's frustrating that you can't
Wait, hold on. Can you go a little bit more into that? Why do you think it's one of the biggest failures?
Why do I think it's... Because, first of all, It's incredible. I don't think people understand the degree to which the goalposts have moved with things like charter schools and merit pay and private school vouchers. Now, there's lots of research, and some of it's conflicting, but generally the results from these things have been extraordinarily underwhelming. The median charter school still does not perform any better than the median public school. Private school vouchers have not seen the sort of enormous gains that were promised. Merit pay has been a disaster. New York suspended its merit pay policy because it was delivering incoherent results. And the thing you have to understand is if you go back and you study the original rhetoric about which these things were talked, these were not going to be, reforms that would have these sort of small impacts and gradually result in better outcomes. They were seen as being magic bullets that would help to solve education. Just like the constant endorsement of technology as a way to solve educational problems. Again and again and again, the empirical research fails to find any difference between students who use these educational technologies and those who don't. And yet again and again and again, educational technologies are posited as this enormous tool with which we're going to raise kids out of bad test scores. Why? Because educational technologies cost a lot of money to make and to sell, and so they represent an enormous profit opportunity. In terms of the extremity of its rhetoric, in terms of what it said it could get done, and after 20, 25 years of this enormously powerful and well-funded apparatus trying to push for change, what they actually have to show for it is pathetic, Connor. The results of the education
I think that's certainly a fair critique. That compared to their initial rhetoric, it has been a tremendous failure. I think that it's a very different thing to call it one of the biggest actual failures in the history of American public policy, because that would be something that had like catastrophic results, right? And to me, the education reform movement hasn't had catastrophic results. It just hasn't had much to show for all the things that it's done. And I think that part of the reason why this hasn't led to a kind of pendulum shift that you might want to see back to like a full embrace of the public education system, right, is because the public education system also is seemingly unable to improve itself, right? It's not as if...
Exactly right. That is exactly right. You're exactly right. The public education system is also unable to improve itself because what we identify as educational failure is a result of the structural economic distribution of our society. What we see when we see these deeply unequal outcomes, when we see deeply unequal outcomes stratified by race, when we see deeply unequal outcomes stratified by social class, when we see deeply unequal outcomes when it's stratified by the parent's education level, what we're seeing is the result of the socioeconomic structure of American society. And it's true. Neither public schools, nor charter schools, nor private schools, nor merit pay can address those inequalities. And what we continue to find over and over again, we're dancing around this thing. We dance around it and we look at it with the lens of education. But at the center is the fact that this is an incredibly unequal society, and that inequality is baked into the very basic structure of how our society is aligned. And so we have a choice. I mean, we can either address structural inequality as structural inequality and try to put some economic muscle behind it, or we can continue to try to address it with education and continually be disappointed with what we find.
Okay, so there's a couple of things that come to mind after that. One is that it seems to me that certain voucher and charter school experiments, right, however mediocre their results, seem like they were, in fact, an attempt to address structural inequality, right? There were some of these experiments that were saying, okay, we're going to go into these neighborhoods where people have no educational choices, and we're going to give them a choice. We're going to try to get them invested in, whatever our particular model is. We're going to invest in these parts of the community, and we're going to hope it works out well, right? Now, maybe that was doomed from the beginning for some reason that, people foresaw, but it does seem like it was an attempt to address structural inequality, was it not?
Sure, but it's a very poor way to address structural inequality. Okay, and look, I understand that baked into the rhetoric of education is the idea that it is a tool for raising people out of poverty or for ameliorating inequality. But
Uh-huh.
the votes come back in. The evidence is in. Look at a guy so there's a guy, Matt Brunig, who writes for Demos, I think. And one of the things that he has shown is that rising educational achievement, right, like in terms of who ends up getting college degrees and just a total accumulation of college and professional and graduate degrees, has no relationship to declining poverty or to increasing social mobility or to decreasing social inequality, right? Like we have, in something like the last 40 years, we've tripled our total educational attainment, and at the exact same time, we've become a much less equal country, and the poverty rate hasn't budged, right? You cannot, and this is the thing, Connor, like, I would just like for people to acknowledge that, like, you can't address macroeconomic inequality through the tool of schools. I mean, it's time to admit that experiment has failed.
So it seems, okay, so it seems like there's a tension, right, in the position you take, because on one hand, you want to say that it's that inputs are hugely important, and this is basically the biggest thing that matters in education, right?
Right.
It is these inputs, and that test scores are a terrible way to measure teacher equality, and both of those 2 points, let's say that I concede them for now, right?
Okay.
And then you're also saying that there's this huge, bigger structural economic inequality in America, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have these 3 factors, and I know that your answer isn't to just throw up your hands and we can't do anything or whatever, and that you're committed to public education and to improving it, right?
Right.
But if it's inputs that matter, and if we can't really measure teacher quality very well, then what's the case for better paid teachers? How do you make the case that we should pay teachers more if you're also saying that it's actually the kids that they get and their economic circumstances that make all the difference?
Well, first of all, I'm a socialist, and I am happy to have the sort of the wedge of government be used to provide better working conditions and better pay for a very large public profession that makes significantly less than the people at the top, right? Like, I want people who work a mass job like teaching, which is a job that does not pay very well compared to many other kinds of educated labor. I think that paying them better is in and of itself a good thing for society because of my take on. But I think you kind of answered your own question, which is that I don't think that there's no such thing as quality in teaching. But I do think that we have to broaden our definition of what quality in teaching means, and that right now what we're doing is we're narrowing that definition of quality in teaching. I don't doubt that every student is capable of learning and is incapable of being improved. But I do strongly doubt that every student is capable of meeting these minimum thresholds that are arbitrarily defined in terms of test scores. So, yes, I think that the evidence shows that in terms of outcomes like standardized test scores or GPA, that inputs are stronger than teacher factors. But if we broaden our definition of what a teacher is and what a teacher does, to include things like compassion and empathy, to include things like helping to inculcate what we think of as democratic values, to include things like sponsoring creativity, things that are all very, very hard to adjudicate. I recognize that, right? And cannot be adjudicated with standardized tests. Then that, to me, creates a definition of educational quality that is not sort of dependent upon test scores. In other words, I think that there is such a thing as differences in the quality of teaching, but I think that all of the ways in which the education reform movement writ large wants to assess that is a rigged deck, and I don't think that it makes sense to base public policy on that sort of rigged game.
Well, I'm certainly with you on broadening our notions of what teacher quality means. The one other thing that I wanted to say in response to something you were talking about before about socioeconomic factors, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would certainly not deny that a huge part of the challenge of public education in America is dealing with people who enter the system in dire circumstances, right? and and exist in dire circumstances for most or the whole time that they're within the system. I also don't think that that is all that is going on. And I guess what I mean by that, and I'm sorry to keep returning to California, but I'm
okay.
going to do it one more time.
Okay.
So here are a few things that kind of shaped how I still think about this issue, right? One is growing up, going to Catholic schools and knowing a bunch of other people who went to Catholic schools, which are this system where basically the school can fire any teacher at will anytime that it wants to do so. And yet it's exceedingly rare for a teacher to be fired. Even the teachers who aren't that great and who could probably be replaced by a new teacher who would turn out to be better in a couple of years tend to stick around. And the best teachers, even the teachers who are doing the most challenging material, me and my friends were certainly straying from Catholicism by the time we were in high school, and kind of identified with the teachers who seemed to be pushing back most against the sort of what little religious line there was at the school. And those teachers weren't even fired. I understand in the abstract the fear of coming and having your job taken away, and I'm sure that if my job had some like built-in tenure, and I had a union who represented me, I would, out of self-interest, fight to keep that in place. There's no doubt in my mind. But both in my own experience and looking everywhere in America that I've been able to look, I've never been able to find a case of just like the wanton capricious firing of teachers going back like decades and decades and decades. And if you go back far enough, you will find it. You will find that in the same way that Boss Tweed would come in and replace all the municipal employees with his cronies, this would happen in school districts. But the way that it used to happen doesn't happen anymore. That's not to say that some new way couldn't happen, but I've never seen it. And the other thing that kind of shapes the way I think about these issues is, I grew up in a relatively prosperous area, Orange County, and it's an interesting place because Southern California, like some other places in the United States, you really see housing values attached to the quality of school districts. So Irvine, California has great public schools, and housing prices in Irvine are significantly higher for that reason. And you can look at like the school district lines and where people move in housing prices, and you can see it very clearly. And then you get down into like Southern Orange County, and the school districts, some of them are really good, some of them are really bad. It doesn't have a hell of a lot to do with socioeconomic level. Like, Newport Beach has significantly worse schools than Irvine does. It has plenty and plenty of rich people in Newport Beach, right? You can look at some areas of Southern Orange County, and like it just doesn't. If you drew an income map and you drew a quality of schools map, it wouldn't be exactly the same at all. And there are a lot of areas of Orange County, Costa Mesa, where I grew up, is one where the public schools aren't very good. If they were better, I probably would have gone to them. And yet no one seems able to fix this, despite having a population of students that would seem to be as amenable to fixing as anywhere would be, because these aren't people who are entering the schools in dire circumstances. So it seems to me that, like, I guess you could say this points to the problem being unfixable. I don't particularly think that that's the case, because there are better schools just like a few miles away, right? But it leads me to believe that socioeconomics isn't so much of a factor in every school district that we should just write it off to that. And if we were talking about a set of schools in a terrible neighborhood in Baltimore or in the Bronx, I would be much more willing to believe that the dire circumstances of the kids coming into the school were the biggest explanatory factor. But I just have a very hard time believing that about other communities in the United States. And I guess it kind of goes a long way toward my being very averse to like national education policy and sort of one size fits all solutions to this. My kind of ideal would be, you know, doing a lot more at the community level as far as empowering principals. Where if a good teacher got fired by a principal in, at a high school in Costa Mesa, it would be very easy for that person to go and get a job in Huntington Beach instead of a system where you're kind of like locked in and it's almost impossible to get fired. But if you do, you'll never teach again. And like,
well, Connor,
I'm sorry, did you say?
I mean, I would never say that there is no school side or teacher side impact on student outcomes. But I will say we're talking about broad public policy, right? And when we're talking about broad public policy, the reality is that the really deep problems in our country's education system, and I would hasten to say for anyone who doesn't know this who's watching, our middle class students are quite competitive. Our upper class students are very competitive internationally in international comparisons. A Chinese immigrant, a baby who comes here from China and goes through American public schools, that on average will outperform the kids that they left behind in China. Right? Our problems are overwhelmingly concentrated in just a level of total failure at the bottom that simply doesn't exist in a lot of other countries. Okay. Do I think that there's like literally no difference from school to school or teacher to teacher? No, I don't. I do know that when we're looking at this problem of this size, it makes sense to look where we find the problems most often. And the reality is, again, Mike, as you acknowledged, socioeconomic status is a huge predictor. Another big predictor is race, and this is a very controversial topic. We don't know why this happens. At every level of the income strata, there are observable differences, consistent differences between Black and Hispanic students, white students, and Asian students. Some people like Charles Murray, chalk that up to inherent genetic differences. As you know, I disagree strongly with that. The racial achievement gap is a mystery that we haven't been able to solve. One of the enormous frustrations for people like me who read a ton of education research and do education research is in the inability to find consistent ways to sort of improve pedagogical outcomes once you've already controlled for these factors. Because you're right, there is differences. The problem is that the differences tend to be either hard to investigate empirically or they aren't consistent. So I mentioned New York's their merit pay system and how it was suspended for a time because they were getting incoherent results. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that you would have a teacher would one semester be among the highest scorers, and the very next semester be among the lowest scorers. There was very low correlation from one year to the next. You had teachers who were teaching multiple classes, as people tend to do in a high school, and in some classes they'd be the best teacher in the school, and in some they'd be the worst. And you also have, and this happens fairly frequently if you get out and talk to principals, a situation where the teachers who the principal thinks are the best teachers do poorly in the metrics, and the teachers who the principal thinks are the worst teacher, just from observation, from talking to other teachers, do the best. We are devoting an enormous amount of resources and attention to trying to figure out why these differences happen. I can only say that we have to always remember that there's teachers, there's parents, and there's students who are involved in this interchange that creates educational outcomes. And there is a lot of reason to believe, on both an empirical and an anecdotal level, that parents and children control a very large portion of that variance. So if you look at someone like me, I was a fine student for a long time, and then I had some very difficult personal times, and that reduced my, dramatically hurt my grades, right? And if you sort of aggregate that across a whole school, maybe this kid's parents get divorced, maybe this kid has some sort of a trauma, who knows? You've got all these situations where there's just all this variance that gets sort of added to the mix. And I know that's
very... sure. I mean, and this is true of high-performing students too, right?
Right, absolutely.
And it's not that I disagree with that. It's just that, look, I did well all through school, and got into a good college. And what would I attribute that to? First, my parents, right? Yeah. and educational advantage that I've had being read to as a kid, having support at home, like all of these things were obviously huge factors. Um, I can still think back to the very best teachers that I had.
Mm-hmm.
And I can think back to the very worst teachers that I had, and they aren't very hard to identify. And like there's a huge range in the middle, right? Where I'm not at all confident in my ability to parse who is better, who is worse, who's the best teacher. I have no idea.
Right.
But most principals that I've talked to have also told me it's pretty easy for them to think of, if there were some kind of like, hypothetical, like weird pro sports draft where you got to protect like certain people and everyone else was free game to like be free agents or be taken by other teams or schools or whatever. Mm-hmm. Most principals could tell me, this core of people is hugely important to this school and hugely important to the kids and whatever. And they could also say, yeah, this couple of people are really, this person is clearly burned out and has been for 5 years, or this person is just not suited to be a teacher. And I don't know how my predecessor let them get through for tenure, but like, it's just not right. Right. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that, while I understand your big picture commitment to, let's broadly define it as like socialist labor practices, right? Mm-hmm. It seems to me that when you talk about a school and you talk about that underperforming teacher, right? Even if we say that there's a good of like one stable job that that's creating, right? It's like every single person has a factor of at least like 30-1, right? Where this one burned out teacher, right, is affecting 30 kids at least every year if they're teaching just like one class of people all the time. Maybe they have a bunch of classes and it's like orders of magnitude higher than that. But to me, it doesn't ultimately serve equality to offer protection to people who are having that kind of negative impact on, I think that it hurts the least well-off kids the most, but, it hurts all of the kids. I can think of terrible teachers I had in a subject that I was taking for the first time and kind of like wasn't ever interested in that subject again, right? And maybe if it was a good teacher, I would have been very interested in that subject. It just seems to me that like the stakes are very high, and while you make an excellent point when you cite, both research and anecdote talking about how hard it can be to nail down, exactly how good a teacher is and to measure this, especially with test scores, which we both agree are flawed. It isn't like this is unlike every other job in the world, right? Where right. It can be hard to have a metric of exactly how good someone is at their job. And yet I would think that we would agree that lots of organizations are able to improve by having managers in place who can hire and fire people that they think are talented or less talented and replace them with people that they think are more talented.
And yet there's very few professions where there is a massive kind of public relation campaign being waged against them, right? And this is,
right, but this is because teachers both have this important impact in like the lives of kids, who many people have, right? But also because teachers have lots more protection than most people, than most voters, right? Like, I've never enjoyed anything even close to the kind of protection that every third-year school teacher has in California.
And yet, Conor, you could go and be wrong again and again and again, right? And you could still keep your job, right? I mean, I won't name them by name, but there are people at your magazine who have been disastrously wrong on foreign policy, both in terms of predictions and in terms of their opinion about what should happen. There are plenty of people in the media who've been disastrously wrong on questions again and again and again, and yet there is no professional consequences for them for doing so. We just went through a replay of the run-up to the Iraq War with the rise of ISIS, and so many of the voices that were speaking in favor of an armed military response for the United States against ISIS were also speaking in 2003. They still occupy positions of great power and influence, right? So I guess it just comes down to a matter of how we define for each other, what we need to see that sort of as quality in a teacher or in a pundit or in a journalist. And I want to say before we go, because I was not kidding, and I mean this very sincerely, okay? Again, I would, not speaking as a, not being able to speak as a teacher myself, but it would seem to me that yes, if we could figure out a way to get money to pay teachers more in exchange for some of that job security, so that this could continue to be a profession that can attract talent, right? Because we want to be responsible and sort of setting up incentives to attract talented people, that I can get on board with that. But it has to happen in a context where we can tell the truth about what has not worked in the education reform movement. And as long as that movement, as it's currently constituted, is dominated by people like Bill Gates and like Arne Duncan and like Michelle Rhee, who refuse to respond to evidence that cuts against the things that they have been saying for years, we're not going to see some kind of a grand bargain. And I think that there's an opportunity for people like you in the media who are critical of public teachers unions, who don't like the status quo, who think we're capable of doing more, but who can also turn around and say, hey, you know what, Arne Duncan? Like, when you say that even special ed kids just need teachers who care more, like, that's nuts. That, hey, Michelle Rhee, when you say that the ability to fire teachers is correlated with educational outcomes, that's not true. When you can say things like, broadly speaking, the charter movement has failed to have the kind of gains it was supposed to see. You could say things like, merit pay has a lot of perverse incentives and it's not clear that it works. There's room for people who are neither protectionist towards the teachers' unions and the status quo, but who don't get on board with the corporate education reform movement that just seems totally impervious to evidence that cuts against what they already believe.
Well, look, I certainly agree that that the education reform movement should have its claims put to rigorous examination. And I am already with you on the inadvisability of this massive shift toward test score-based everything. I guess the comment I would leave you with is that I think that there is ultimately an unworkable tension between these two desires you have: one for teaching at the primary and high school level to be a high prestige profession, and on the other hand, to extend to the people doing these jobs a public employee union level of job protection. I think that when you look at high prestige professions in America, and the reason that they are high prestige, it isn't just money, although money is certainly a factor. It is also a combination of like the ambition of the people going into it and the perception of what it takes to go into it and succeed and fail. If you talk to someone who is a lawyer at a corporate law firm, right, you may have tremendous contempt for what it is their particular law firm does, or you may respect what their particular law firm does, whatever. But you have a pretty high degree of confidence that they both excelled academically and were highly competent at lots of different things, and that they beat a lot of people out for their spot. Mm-hmm. And that if they stop performing, they can be fired at any moment. And, you know, it may be that as a society we have prestige backwards in a lot of ways, and I think we actually do. I don't know if we would agree with the exact ways. But it seems to me that in any kind of realistic context, you can't have a profession that both protects people who aren't performing very well and that has a high level of prestige and respect as outsiders. And I think that most Americans look at teachers and they respect certain individual teachers that they've had or that their kids have that have demonstrated a high degree of competence. And these people are actually like very respected and, you know, often cited on surveys as like the most influential person in my life or something like that. But teachers as a category don't have that same prestige because there's a perception that you can get into that job and after 3 years just coast for the rest of your life. And you can. It's not to say that everyone does, but you can do that.
I would just say that it's sort of, I mean, I would look at I would endorse Chris Hayes' book and say that the notion that prestige comes along with sort of is sort of accumulated by people who perform well in their job, I think that's just flatly empirically untrue. I mean, look at Wall Street, right? I mean, Wall Street is the definition of a high prestige, high paying position, and they nearly ruined the entire world. They nearly destroyed the economy, right? And I think that we are living in a situation in which elites have essentially no accountability at all. But look, okay, like I think I understand what you're saying. I think underneath all of this, and you're right, there's things that, there's work to be done in the margins, and we can fight over important questions like how hard should it be to fire a teacher, and we can both broadly agree that should be getting rid of bad apples a little bit easier, while disagreeing about the general tenor of how that negotiation would happen. But I just think that the bottom line on education is that many people probably tacitly believe, but think it's too impolite to say, that what we actually have is a country that is just flagrantly unequal in many, many ways. And that to really see the kind of improvements in education that we'd want, we'd have to actually reorganize society in a structural way. And I don't think people actually want to do that. And until we reconcile the fact that that it's impossible to ask for an educationally equal society while we have such a flagrantly unequal economic society, this discussion will be somewhat useless.